Hey everybody, Red Mage here. Welcome to this deep dive into the Shadowdark RPG. Essentially what I'm going to be doing is going a bit more slowly and a bit more carefully than I usually do in these flip-throughs. But I do want to give a bit of a review and a bit of my experience with this system. I've had some time with it now, and I think it's really, really cool. And I've gotten to kind of see why it's cool, I think, at this point. I've been playing it for a while. I didn't want to do this too early because my first impressions of it were one thing, and I wanted to make sure they were correct and accurate, and some of them were, and some of them weren't. And so as I've played it more, I've got just a better sense of what the game is like and what it's about. This is the premium PDF. On the front cover, you have typical front cover information, but it's really, really great stuff. Stuff you might use at a glance. Weapons, costs, and attack damage properties, armor properties, and then a few basic things like DC, distance, spell focus, morale, and dying. But then you get the actual book itself, and one of the things that I think is so cool is that all of the page numbers in this book are hyperlinked. So if you want to go to a particular artist's work, if you want to go to, as we'll see in the table of contents, a particular page, chapter, or heading, you can just click right on it. So the layout of this book is one of the things that is top-notch. 10 out of 10, layout is excellent. Really, before I guess I get into the game itself, I'll pause on this beautiful piece of art here, which I just love. I wanted to talk a little bit about the simplicity of this game. Because, simplicity is one of those things that RPGs can do in better ways or in worse ways. There are some simple RPGs that are too simple. Then there are some that claim to be simple and are still pretty complex. And I was trying to put my finger on what makes Shadowdark simple. And I think relative to 5th edition, which is where it's certainly coming from, it is a simple system. And I think the way that it does that is through flat math. Now, that's 5e's claim to fame, right? If you guys remember during the D&D 1 playtest and all that stuff, it was like, well, we're flattening the math. That was WotC's kind of, recurring statement. We're flattening the math. And the goal behind that was, first of all, to make it easier to run at the table so that you didn't have to have tons and tons of floating modifiers and all these crazy numbers and plus 36s to your attack rolls and all this stuff that you saw in 3rd edition and to some degree in 4th edition. They wanted to get rid of that, and they also wanted to keep, say, creatures more relevant, so that because the math was more flat, goblins, for example, could be used later. You just increase the number of them. But, whereas in 3rd edition, a goblin really couldn't hit you anymore after a few levels. It just couldn't pose a threat to you. In 5th edition, the goal was any goblin can always be a threat to you. The question is just how many of them are there, right? So you increase the number of them, and the output will still be a challenge. Because each of them individually can hit you still. They're still a threat. They're not as much of a threat as they were at low levels, but the flattened math allows creatures to stay relevant a lot longer. And to be able to mix low-level and high-level parties together. It was just designed to facilitate a sort of a more low-level campaign, but also to ease that transition into high-level campaign so that the DM doesn't have to continually come up with new monsters and all of that. And to some degree, 5e succeeded at that, right? To some degree, it did. It's certainly true that I would say up until about level 4, 5, and 6, low challenge rating creatures can still be a challenge in numbers. The problem is, beyond that, right, you start to get into the problem of the math isn't actually flat enough. Health still does increase, hit points still do increase, AC still does increase, attack bonuses still do increase, to the point where it really is meaningless to throw low-level creatures at your party, even in numbers. Or that the number that is required to make the fight a real challenge is so high that it is unmanageable, and you have to come up with different systems to do it. Mass combat rules, or minion rules, or something else. You have to bolster in a new system in order to effectively complete the design philosophy of 5e, which was that simple, flat math. Well, Shadowdark, I think, succeeds where 5e was trying to go. Shadowdark gets to the point where 5e was trying to get. Shadowdark manages to flatten the math even more. And it does this through a number of ways. It gets rid of proficiency bonus, which that in and of itself flattens the math. That means that as you level up, there isn't an automatic increase in your numbers. There will be if you roll on your talents tables at certain degrees, and certain classes get bonuses in very specific features. Fighters, for example, with their weapon of choice, they are going to get more damage with that weapon as they increase. But the basic removal of proficiency as a system and the reliance entirely on advantage-disadvantage means that the numbers will stay basically flat as you level up. Which means that creatures are more likely to be able to still stay relevant as, or rather I should say, when it comes to you hitting creatures. You will be maybe a little bit more likely to be able to hit a goblin at level 5 than at level 1, but not that much, maybe 5 or 10% more likely. Whereas in 5e, usually it became, not only was it, maybe 15, 20% more likely to hit that goblin, but you also had ways of getting advantage, or doing mass damage, or doing automatic damage, or things like that. So there were ways of ignoring the flat math and engaging in sort of math spikes. Shadowdark doesn't really have that. So the flat math persists because of the removal, at least one of the reasons, is the removal of proficiency. Another reason why Shadowdark keeps that flat math is the removal of modifier additions to things. So hit points, right? Modifiers are not added to hit points at every level, which is a huge change. If you have a constitution score of 16 or 18, which players manage to get in 5e fairly easily, then you're looking at an additional boost to your hit points. That's very significant. It's very significant as you level up, which means your hit points as a player go up and up and up and up. Further, the addition of modifiers to damage means that, again, your damage output is going up and up and up and up, and it just moves the range higher. So creatures with 6 hit points, right, if you're rolling a d6 to hit them, well, that means you're probably not likely to kill them. But if you're doing d6 plus 4, well, yeah, you're likely to kill them in one hit. And actually, you're likely to carry through damage to the next target. So Shadowdark, by removing the modifier additions to things, now it does allow you to add, for example, your Constitution modifier to your hit points, but only at first level, and then after that you don't. And then after that, you don't add damage modifiers to your attack rolls, right? To your damage rolls. By removing those modifiers, you continually flatten the math out as you level up, and so once again, damage stays relatively consistent. There are ways of boosting it a little bit by +1, +2. Half your level in some cases gets added to your damage by your weapon of choice for a fighter, for example. But that is a very limited thing. With your weapon of choice, a fighter whose whole job is to be high damage output, and that really is there to help keep pace with wizards and their spells. So the flat math really actually exists in Shadowdark. So in that way, I see Shadowdark as 5e done right. It's kind of like what the 5e designers could have done had they been a little bit more bold, a little bit more willing to actually shave down the game to its basic form. If the focus of the game had been different, I think they it would have changed a lot. So because of all of that reduction in all of those things, that's one of the reasons why Shadowdark, it seems to me, is so effective at being a simple system. The math is really flat. When you learn it at level 1, that experience that you have at level 1 of it being dangerous and of being able to throw lots of different creatures at your party that are all, some of them are goblins, some of them are skeletons, some of them are much more dangerous and scary, that is going to be the kind of game you're playing the whole time you're playing the campaign. The changes in your party are not going to be as significant as they are in 5e, and so the sort of experience that you get from the sort of difference from low-level play to high-level play is really not there. And it starts off relatively close to 5e. They're both pretty similar at low levels, I will admit. But by the time you get to level 3, 4 in D&D, it's a very different game. Whereas by the time you get to level 3 and 4 in Shadowdark, it's pretty consistent. Now, again, some people are not going to like that so much. Some players, especially if you've been in the 5e sphere for a long time, some players really like to feel the sense of power progression. Power gamers in particular, right? They want to feel themselves now as really powerful. That low level is an inconvenience for those kinds of players. Those kinds of players are not necessarily going to enjoy this so much. But I think a lot of players don't recognize how much fun challenge can be. And I think a lot of times people get bored and high-level campaigns never come about because the fun that you have in those first few sessions of the high challenge disappears in favor of power gaming. And that's fun for a session or two, and so you don't notice that you've lost something. The players don't notice that they've lost something. And then by the time they kind of get dissatisfied with it, it's too late. They're already used to the high-level play and the high-level powers and things like that. Okay, so that's one reason why I think Shadowdark is simple. Really what we're looking at is 5e, but 5e done the way that I think 5e, some at least designers in 5e were trying to get it, like where they were trying to get it. Very simple in terms of its flat math. Now the basic mechanic is just exactly 5th edition, right? I mean, you're talking about the same base 6 stats, the same ideas with checks, the same dice to be used, the same mechanic of advantage and disadvantage. So one of the other reasons I think that Shadowdark has been so successful and has appealed to so many people is that it is essentially, it is immediately apparent to people like myself who have been playing 5e. You look at this and you don't have to learn anything new. You just take stuff out. That's basically it, right? You don't have to learn anything new. There's no new systems that are like, oh man, okay, how does this work? If you're playing with a 5e table, you can say, hey, we're going to play a game that's basically 5e. You don't have to learn new names for stats and modifiers. You don't have to learn new mechanics for dice. You don't have to learn new differences for checks or descending, descending armor class or anything like that. It's relatively the same. But that flattened math and a few other changes, quality of life changes, have made it a much more lethal, much more simple, much more old school game. And I think that's, I'm sure other people have discovered this before. This is not my deep insight. A lot of people have seen this stuff. But I think this is what I have discovered as I have played it. It has confirmed what a lot of people had asserted about this game for me, which is that, that it's simpler, it's easier, it's basically 5e without a lot of that extra bloat. I'm like, okay, but what does that exactly mean? Oh, okay, it's flattened. The modifier changes and the lack of proficiency really change the game back to, it keeps basically Shadowdark's whole progression as low-level 5th edition. Another change that makes it simpler is the change to characters and to their development and progression. First of all, the way that you generate characters, you could do your own thing for this. You don't have to follow this exactly, but the way that it is written, as written, means that you're less likely to run into min-maxing, because you're not necessarily, as a player, going to get the character that you had in mind when you started. You roll 3d6 in order. That's it. So if you play the game as written, then you don't get this sense of, well, I guess I can make the character that I had in mind. You have to sort of play what you get. That is a change in mindset. And so a lot of tables don't do this. For example, when I play this, I usually have players roll up 2 or 3. If I do a level 0 campaign, a gauntlet, then we just do it normally as a level 0 gauntlet. But if we do a level 1 game, I usually have my players roll up 2 characters and then choose the one they want. That way it gives them something, a bit more flexibility. Because again, a lot of my players are from 5th edition, and this idea that I'm going to roll a character and play it and get stuck with it, that is slightly beyond what they're thinking. They're not there yet. I think we're getting there, but it certainly isn't where we start. And I didn't want to say, I'm going to force you to play something that you really don't want to play, because that's so different than the experience of 5th edition. So in that way, I think there is a major difference, but a lot of people won't use that. The simplicity of the races, or the ancestries as they're called here, and how they affect the game, which is a very minimal way. Right? For example, like elves have a plus 5% bonus to one thing or the other. And that's it. That's the only difference to play an elf versus something else. If you play a goblin, you can't be surprised. Great. That's the thing that'll help you the whole game, but it's just that's that. Humans get an extra talent roll at level 1, which I think is probably the best one, honestly. It seems to me, well, I'm not sure about the best. It's a really good one. And I think a lot of my players have chosen humans precisely because they recognize the power of the talents. So here we go, right, with the fighters. This is it. This is the difference, or another difference, between Shadowdark and 5e, and its progression. The fact that progression is randomized, you roll, once again prohibits min-maxing. Could you accidentally roll a character that is hyper-powered relative to the game? Absolutely. You could. But it would be very unlikely. And even so, what are you going to get? An 18 strength. That's really it. It maxes out at 18. 18 plus. You can't get a 20. You can't go up to 22. You can't go up to 24. So even if you max out, you're only at a plus 4 relative to a plus 0. So the flattened math means that you're just not as likely to do that. So the fact that progression is limited and randomized means that min-maxing is just basically not possible. And it isn't. What choice? Players get very few choices in the way that they develop. Occasionally they'll get a choice. If they roll 7 to 9, they can pick the stat that gets boosted, but they can't pick feats. They can't pick weapon masteries whenever they want, for example, a fighter. So again, min-maxing is much more difficult. Now, as a result of all that, because the choices are more limited, The other thing that Shadowdark does is it leans much more heavily into the randomness of the game. This is something that Mike Shea noted, I think, in a few videos after he had been running it for a while. But that Shadowdark is incredibly random. It's incredibly random. If you rely on the dice rolls for success, you cannot rely on general success. You're much more likely to fail, even at the thing you're good at, because of the flattened math. Because at best, you're looking at maybe a +3, a +4, which, instead of 5e, where you're looking at +6 with advantage, right? Most of the time, if you're doing something that you're good at, +6 with advantage, which essentially is a +10, which means you're basically going to succeed. The Shadowdark doesn't have that, so even in the areas that you're great, even though they're your focus, you might have a +3 with advantage, say if you're a thief trying to pick a lock, which is pretty high. But the DC, say, is a 15. You're maybe evenly likely to get that, sometimes and not. So randomness is a much more serious factor in Shadowdark. That, in and of itself, lends it to a more old-school, deadly kind of game. Success is not guaranteed. What that means, then, is it tends to fall into those games where you only choose to roll, if you're a player, if you absolutely have to. Because randomness is so high, you want to try to maneuver yourself into a position where you don't have to roll. Games like Maze Rats do this, right, where they make the success roll at the danger roll as a 10+. You're very unlikely to succeed on a danger roll, so you really don't want to do it. You want to plan and describe your actions such that success is guaranteed. The DM says, yeah, of course, you succeed. Why would you need to roll? Shadowdark, without being explicit about that, lends itself to that style of game. But, and this is where there's a bit of a danger for Shadowdark, because it's not explicit and because it looks a lot like 5e, just with simplified mechanics, players might not recognize that. GMs might not recognize that. And so you'll play it the same way you roll a 5e game. You'll play it the same way, just, okay, well, I'm going to change the kinds of monsters I'll throw at them, make it more of a dungeon crawl than a sort of big open world, discussion role-playing game, or, just, diplomacy-heavy game or something like that. Role-play-heavy game. But the fact that luck is so much higher means that players are just going to try to, especially if they're coming fresh off of 5e, which I think is a substantial portion of the Shadowdark player base. They're going to rush right into things expecting to have character sheet solutions instead of having to come up with player solutions. And there aren't that many character sheet solutions. So what I found with my players was that initially there was an immense feeling of paralysis and weakness. I don't have anything I can do, was often what some players seemed to say, or at least they implied it with their kinds of statements. When we first started Shadowdark, man, I don't actually have that much to do. And then, as we played a few more adventures, they realized, oh, I can do anything. Right, this is a role-playing game. I can do anything. The fact that their character sheets didn't have a ton of character sheet solutions, buttons to press to solve the problem, meant that suddenly, oh my goodness, I can try whatever I want. And if I can describe it well enough, I don't even have to roll. Great. That started to become the mindset of my table, and I think it's really started to take off now. And as a result, people are really enjoying the game. There was an initial interest in something new, a fascination with the kind of deadliness and okay, we're going to play something very different. And so that kind of carried through the initial, I would say, almost paralysis that some of my players faced. I don't know if I can do anything here because my character sheet doesn't have an option for it. So it does require a mindset shift that maybe isn't initially apparent because of its proximity to 5th edition. Great piece of art. That's another thing this book does. So presentation in terms of its format is excellent. The art is also excellent. The priest class is really good. And one thing that I've noticed as we've gone through Curse of Strahd and Shadowdark is the absolute power of Turn Undead. Turn Undead, especially in a Curse of Strahd game, is just incredibly strong. It's a really good spell, period. The fact that it can just destroy undead if they fail by 10 or more, that is really powerful. You can just wipe out whole squads of undead from level 1. That's awesome. Makes the priest feel very strong, and I think that's a good thing when you're in the proper setting, meaning facing undead. That's another thing this game does, is the spell power. Spells are unbalanced in just the most proper, perfect way. They are really strong, and I'll get more into that when we get into the spells. But as a consequence of that, players can look at spells and go, wow, I am incredibly powerful. And then they'll try to cast a spell and they fail it. And they go, oh man, I have nothing else I can do. And suddenly they realize that there is a risk reward for choosing to cast spells. That just casting light every 3 minutes, just because you can, taking the light quote unquote cantrip, it's not a cantrip, but taking the light spell in Shadowdark means, yeah, I'm just going to cast light every time and we don't need to take torches. And then suddenly you fail your light spell and you go, uh-oh, I can't. Oops. Well, we should have brought torches. Oh, maybe it's not a foregone conclusion that I'll take light. Maybe it's not even like our first choice to use the light spell. Oh man. And suddenly you start to, the spellcasters start to realize that there is a risk reward system built into their spellcasting. And that if they fail that cast, they are, well, much less useful. And it's only something that comes up occasionally in 5th edition, right? In 5th edition, you cast a save or suck spell, right? You cast Fairy Fire or, Tasha's Hideous Laughter or something like that. And the target saves, and you go, oh man, I wasted my spell. But that's really all you're thinking. You don't think, oh man, I shouldn't have cast that. It was, well, it was just the chance to, because you have so many spell slots in 5th edition, and because you just have this, you have a limited amount of ammunition that you know ahead of time how much you have. Those individual failures, they just feel like misses, right? They just don't feel like the same thing. But in Shadowdark, because you have an unlimited amount of ammunition that could fail at any time, it just, at first, you don't think about it as a player in those terms. You think of it, again, just in my experience, players coming from 5e think of it as, wow, I have unlimited spells. And then the first time they fail that casting, they flip and they say, wow, my spellcasting is terrible. So that is something that does have to be overcome for 5e players when you're going into Shadowdark, is this sense of, man, I'm on top of the world at first, and then, man, I am useless. You have to kind of like go into your casting understanding that. You go into picking your class understanding that. I am going to be on the high or low end of power in any individual session. If I don't want that, I should pick Thief or Warrior. Right? I mean, that's really the way to look at it. If I don't want to be on the high or low end, I want to be a Warrior. The other thing I've discovered is that Backstab is incredibly strong. Incredibly strong. The extra weapon die of damage plus the Thief's ability to get extra backstabs relatively easy with a 3 to 5. The Thief in my game is doing, when he gets that backstab off, he's usually killing a creature in one hit, even creatures that are significantly higher level than he is. That's really cool. That's really cool, but you need to keep that in mind. When the damage is so low and the health is so low, you think in terms of 5e. Sneak attack is a good boost to the damage you're going to be doing every turn. In Shadowdark, sneak attack can be the difference between having an encounter or not. Backstab can mean you just don't have an encounter. You kill the boss, you kill the strongest monster in the room, you kill the target before the fight begins. So that's worth keeping in mind too. I really like that. Again, it has this sort of risk reward. If we can set it up right, we can ignore this. We can avoid this encounter. And because Shadowdark isn't necessarily built as a combat game, and this is another reason I'll come to in a minute here, the combat being sidestepped isn't a problem. Okay, so classes are excellent. Backgrounds, I like how they basically, they step in and do what they kind of already did, right? This is what is the upside of having proficiencies and skills? Well, you can be much more specific in your class options. You can say, well, in your class creation, right? I want to be a fighter who also suddenly has Arcana, right? And who can pick locks. That's cool. You can certainly do that, right? You can certainly do that. But in Shadowdark, because the difference is proficiency isn't present, you can do that anyway. If you have a fighter who happens to have high dexterity, just get a lock, get a lock pick set. It takes up a slot. It doesn't take up a slot for a thief, but it takes up one slot, and now you can pick locks. You just need to roll. And if you happen to have a background, say you picked Thieves Guild as your background, well, you still have advantage on it. The difference between advantage is much stronger. In a game with flattened math, advantage is much stronger. At least it seems to me. So picking a background is much more important in Shadowdark than it is in 5e, where backgrounds really are there to get you a couple skills and proficiencies. Alignment is cool. It's just pretty much the same thing. I like the deities and the way that they work, but it's not a huge significant change there in terms of the difference between it and 5e. But I like how they're laid out here. Pretty straightforward. Pretty good. Titles are also cool. Players were wondering what titles meant. My players are like, okay, so how do titles work? And I'm like, well, they kind of just, they work as much as you and I want them to work. How much do you want to lean into it? How much do I want to lean into it? And they were like, oh, okay. I guess they thought there was going to be some mechanical system built into the titles thing, but no, it's not like 5e where there's mechanical things built in for everything. No, nothing like that for titles. It's up to you and the GM to come to work together to come up with a good title. The basic stuff here, level 0 characters, the gauntlet idea, I think is really well designed in this particular game. Of course, it doesn't come from Shadowdark, it comes from other systems, but I think it's well done here, and I like this idea of beginner's luck, where all level 0 characters can use any piece of equipment because they happen to be lucky for now. That's cool. Now the gear, the basic gear is also cool, and I like this idea of slots. It's one of the things that changes from 5e, the emphasis on the exploration elements. So the way that is done is by changing the rules with regards to rations, rest, and gear. And then by removing a lot of the extra abilities that undermine those things, like Dark Vision, Good Berry, and spells that let you rest quickly or in completely safe places. The removal of those elements and the emphasis of things like carrying capacity and darkness, right? The emphasis of those things means that the third pillar of traditional D&D, which is exploration, is re-emphasized and present here. So it's not so much that there has been a bunch of extra rules that are added in that makes it possible to do these extras. There isn't a huge extra system designed for exploration. Nothing like that. Instead, things have been removed, and a few things have been emphasized. Things that you could do in 5e, like you could remove Good Berry, you could remove Dark Vision. You could add in a very basic equipment list. But most people don't do that. And again, it's as written, most tables, I should say, just ignore carrying capacity. Shadowdark lays it out, says here's some carrying capacity rules. And that's awesome. Because it does re-emphasize, as I said, it re-emphasizes that exploration element, which is a fun element of the game. It's also something that my players didn't understand. The idea that, oh man, I can't carry everything that I want. They didn't see that as they saw it as a flaw with the game. This system seems here at first, right, again, in the first couple sessions, this system seems just designed to limit us without providing any fun as a result, because they were not yet into this mindset of thinking of challenge as fun. They were thinking of success as fun. Simply. And the fun of success is the fun of overcoming challenge. So this idea of, okay, well, we have to bring torches, we have to bring rations, we have to get, someone has to have this. The idea that, okay, I'm just going to drop my pack because I'm not using this stuff. And then realizing later, oh man, I really wish we'd had that torch right now. Like that happened to my players. And they started to have to make these decisions. Okay, well, we need to have this, we need to have that, we need to find a pack animal. These sorts of things that 5e doesn't really do unless you decide to, the players decide to lean into them and roleplay them. Shadowdark required. Again, as written, you could ignore this, but it would be ignoring one of the I think one of the things that makes this particular game interesting, in my opinion. Armor. This is another reason why the math has been reduced. The reduction of AC from the different types of armor. Leather armor is 11, chainmail is 13, plate mail is 15 instead of 18, right? And then you can have a shield, which is +2. That's great, but then you're looking at taking up gear slots. If you use a shield, you're looking at only using one-handed weapons, which severely reduces your damage in combat. So I really like this, because there isn't this curved math, right? The difference between doing a D8 and a D10, or a D6 and a D10 in damage is huge when creatures have like 8 hit points, right? But when you're doing D6 +4 or D10 +4, that it matters less. Because D6 +4 means you're still likely to, if you pick the lower weapon, you're still very likely to kill things because you have that big bonus. So the fact that you've removed that makes the decision to, say, take a shield actually more important. Actually more important. You're much more likely to take a shield But then you realize that's a massive trade-off. Whereas often, I think in 5th edition, for the min-maxers, right, the difference between taking a two-handed weapon and a shield is, do I want to kill the thing 3 times over or just 2 times over, right? It's very often what we see. The list of weapons is really, really limited. And another thing that makes this game, in my opinion, a lot stronger is the fact that Kelsey, in her design, she wanted ranged and finesse to be weaker, simply put. And that was one of the problems I found with 5th edition very early, was that you could have these incredibly lethal ranged builds. And really, if you just had a party of 4 fighters who all focused on ranged combat and picked the right feat, right, sharpshooter essentially, then you just have this mass damage that's going out every turn from a distance. And in the design of this game, finesse weapons, there's only 1 finesse weapon in the base game. And ranged weapons, a longbow only does d8 damage. And you're not adding dex to that. So the difference in damage outputs is really interesting. You can't do a dex build fighter that's going to be doing as much damage as a strength-based fighter. You just can't do it. That's one of the problems of 5th edition, was that strength became a dump stat unless you picked a very specific build that made it not a dump stat. But with the use of, with the change to the way finesse works, the number of finesse weapons, and the change to carrying capacity, strength suddenly becomes much more important. But so does dex. Dex still has a good value to it. So, again, I think it's worth noting that for a minute, that there was a lot of attention was paid to damage output and to making sure that every class felt distinct, and that you couldn't step on somebody else's toes and also simultaneously do your own thing better than they do. So, like, you know, a thief, a ranger, say, or maybe a thief is a better example, a rogue in 5th edition, very often has better AC because it's dex, or at least comparable AC to the fighters, at least at low levels, and is doing much more damage than they are, and has a lot of utility. Early on, rogues just feel way more fun than fighters in 5th edition. That's not the case in Shadowdark. Great tables. That's another thing I want to talk about when it comes to this book, is the way that it approaches GM advice and help. Before we do that, though, I want to talk about advancement and this idea, again, of focusing on treasure rather than killing monsters. Now, killing monsters is presented as an optional rule as experience, but one of the things that has been talked about at length is the value, in the online spheres, the value of doing treasure for XP rather than killing monsters for XP, or rather than doing milestones or things like that. And one of the things treasure for XP does is it certainly changes the kinds of characters, right? What's the old adage? Players will do what you reward, right? That's the old adage. Players will do what you reward. So if you reward them with treasure, or rather XP for treasure, they're going to go for treasure. If you reward XP for killing monsters, they're going to kill monsters. And the question is, where do you want them to err, right? Do you want to err them being murder hobos, so they're going around killing everything to get XP? Well then, if you want that to be the result, that kind of campaign, a combat-heavy campaign, you give experience for overcoming challenges in combat. If you want to reward story, then you give them XP for milestones, right? For like accomplishing big moments in the story. You just give them a level when they do things that you want them to do, which means they're going to try to find your story and follow it. That's how they level up. If you give them experience for treasure, then they are going to try to find treasure. And so in a game that is based on dungeon crawling for treasure, that's the goal of the game, giving experience for that is an awesome thing to do as a base idea. Now, 5th edition focuses on killing monsters. What that means is that it tends towards being a combat game. Or the other obvious alternative is, and the one that's presented as the secondary choice, is milestone. And most games bounce back and forth. At most published adventures for 5th edition bounce back and forth between those. They'll say, if you're doing XP for creatures, here's how much you can get. If you're doing milestones, this is when you should level them up. So that shows you what 5e leans into: combat and story. DM story, right? Progression at set moments. Well, what Shadowdark does by focusing on gold is it puts the power into the player's hands How do you want to level up? How do you want to get your treasure? Do you want to go and kill the dragon and take his hoard? Well, you'll level up that way. Do you want to sneak into the dragon's hoard, steal the treasure without him noticing and get out? Well, you'll get treasure that way. Do you want to rally the local townsfolk to go in and charge the dragon to kill him for you while you take the gold while he's distracted by them, aka the Hobbit? You level up that way. That is the genius of a gold for XP system, is that you give the players freedom to approach the situation however they like, because the goal isn't the how to put it. The reward doesn't come from the way they solve the problem, which is what gold for combat, what XP for combat does, right? You get experience for the way that you solve the problem. The goal, the XP comes from solving the problem, getting to the result. So I really think this is a brilliant, especially when you're building the game to be more of a dungeon crawl and you want to emphasize the exploration elements. Going to an XP for gold system really does emphasize that. Now, as a result, again, players are going to tend to then create characters who want gold and who are going to be more gold focused. Not everybody, but it's going to be you're going to get more players like that. Or rather, I should say more characters like that. So then it's going to be harder to do things like, I would say, story-based systems, because players are always going to have an eye on, well, we need to find treasure. So if you're going to do a Monster Hunter campaign, change this. And if you're going to do a story-based game, change this. So in Curse of Strahd, I've changed it from gold to accomplishing goals, but I've kept the same tiers of goals. And so as a result, it's sort of a broken down milestone system. But because I have changed it not to like you get a level when I think you're fit, rather, what are your stated goals as a party? And you get experience for getting closer to those goals, or getting closer to achieving those things. So I've talked about that more in my other Shadowdark videos. I'm not going to do it here. But this idea of rewarding people for the success of their plan rather than the means that they take to achieve that success, that's a really good way, a really good thing. And I think that's Gold for XP stumbles onto that system. And Milestone does it too, but Milestone does it in a really, really ham-fisted way. So breaking it down, I think, is really great. But Gold for XP is perfect for this kind of game. Random characters, easy tables for generating random characters. And again, this goes to one of the brilliances of this game, which is the random table system. Now, I've talked about Magic already at this point, and it's cool. I don't think I'm going to go into it too much more here. But the critical failure tables and the priest, disfavor tables really do mean that there is a risk for being a caster that is serious and has long-term effects. I really like that because the spells themselves, which by the way are hyperlinked, which is so good, again, going back to the design of this book, the spells themselves are quite strong, especially the wizard spells. Some of the priest spells are quite good. Cure Wounds is incredibly strong until it's not. And I think that's the thing that players are starting to figure out, my players, as they're going through. That the spells are incredibly powerful until they're not. And then they're going to have to rely. So again, the difference between Shadowdark and 5e, one of the differences, is the emphasis on player solutions rather than character sheet solutions. Character sheet solutions are only interesting, in my opinion, if there is a risk-reward system built in. Right? Combat, for example. Combat is a character sheet solution. I have weapons on my character sheet with damage associated with them. The problem is the enemy's hit points. I have to hit them more than they hit me. So, and I have a risk-reward system. If I choose this button, if I press the attack button, right, and I roll the d20 and I hit and I deal damage, well, I have a reward. I take their health down, and if I do that enough, I kill them. But the risk is they can do that to me. They can damage me, and my health will go down to 0, and then I will die. So there's a risk-reward system built into combat, which makes it interesting. There's a question of success or failure. I'm totally okay with character sheet solutions like that, where I can't think of a way to solve it out of my head. So I'm going to pick this button on my sheet, press it, and there's a chance it will hurt me. So it's not a go-to every time. But if it's a go-to every time, then why would I ever create a complex solution for something that I can just do right here? An example of that would be something like, why would I bother coming up with a really intricate system of mirrors to light up the dungeon, right, to reflect the light from outside into this room so that I can see in the room while I'm fighting without holding a torch? Why would I bother coming up with a plan like that if I have dark vision, right? So 5e has a lot of character sheet solutions without drawbacks, whereas Shadowdark doesn't really have that. It has your background, which gives you some skills, and gives you some advantage on some kinds of checks. And it has combat abilities for the most part. Those are the things that you can do without any real risk. The other thing that it seems to have in that regard are spells. When you first start, you say, I can cast these spells over and over. Players don't think of themselves as going to fail those checks. Oh, it's a DC 10 or 11 to cast a spell? Oh, I'm never going to fail it. Which means I can cast, let's see a good example. I can cast Charm Person over and over and over and over. And the power of Charm Person is D8 days, a humanoid of level 2 or less. That's so good. Early on especially. It's so good. So Charm Person, infinitely cast over and over. Perfect. It's a character sheet solution. I can press it over and over. It's great. And then they fail it. And they go, uh-oh. And they start to realize that spells in Shadowdark are not character sheet solutions. Or rather, they are, but they have a risk reward built in. If you fail them, now you can't cast that spell again, at least until you take a rest, and maybe longer if you've critically failed. So I really, really do like that element of the spells here. And I like that they are very strong to really reward players who want to play that more risk-reward game. Fighters and thieves are much more solid, standard, and consistent. And if you want to play that kind of game, you pick those classes. If you want the more risky, with high reward, you are really rewarded for playing priests and wizards. I like that. That's super cool. So again, the game really, really, I think, does a great job there. And the spells are powerful, but they're not, the end of the world powerful. I mean, Charm Person is pretty dang good, but the utility spells are in some ways much more powerful than the damage dealing spells. Fireball does 4d6 damage. I think 4d6 damage. Maybe 4d8 damage. Let me go back to it. Where is Fireball? Fireball. Yeah, 4d6 damage. Which in Shadowdark is a lot of damage, but it's 4d6. You could do 4 damage with Fireball. No, you could do 4 damage much more reasonably than you could do, 8 damage in 5th edition, because I guess it's 8d6 in 5th edition. So you could theoretically do 8 damage with your Fireball in 5th edition, but that's very unlikely. Whereas 4d6 is unlikely, but not as unlikely. So doing minimum damage with Fireball isn't unlikely. Now, just as doing maximum damage is doing 24 damage is also very possible. And if you crit succeed with your Fireball, then you're doing 8d6 damage. Well, then suddenly you've done a huge amount of damage in Shadowdark terms. That's going to kill almost anything in the game. Okay, I really like these spells. I think they're great, very, very flavorful, and they're very... The power level isn't a problem given the rest of the game and its design. Some good advice for adventuring, and how rolling the dice works, and the d6 decider if you need to make a decision, right? Luck tokens and how to give, and how many to give. And I like the way that luck tokens are given here. I usually use the pulp rule for luck tokens, which is there's no limit to the number you can have. It does make things like bless a little less valuable, or maybe a little more valuable unless you put a limit to bless. But I do think that it's cool to give out more luck tokens and to let players kind of hoard them and spend them. So I've been giving luck tokens out pretty frequently to my players, and they spend them very much, a lot. Good advice for using stats, and I like how, again, this book gives most of its advice on 1 or 2 pages. It's keeping things very limited and very, very concise. So when it comes to the way that it addresses the GM, it respects you. The game respects the GM to be creative, to understand what it's saying, and to be flexible with this stuff. Most people who play Shadowdark have played other RPGs before. This game knows that. So it does give you some basic advice, but it's limited in its space and scope. It doesn't give you pages and pages and pages of how to run this game. Initiative is cool. This is one of the areas where I have not actually played the base initiative. I don't play with just set initiative. I've been doing group initiative just with a D4. Or a D6, rather. A D6 is how I use it. I guess I could use a D4. The difference is that just D6 seems easier to me in my mind. I go to it more. But a simple D6 roll every round for group initiative has made this really a lot more interesting, and it's just as fast as doing even set initiative, I think. Well, not just as fast, because that's obviously faster. You just automatically go into that. But I tend to think of group initiative as being more fun than this broken up initiative by time. At the beginning of the game, the GM establishes initiative, or the order in which the players act. So it's just, that's interesting. This is another rule, that the constant timer and light source idea I haven't really used that so much. I've used it a little bit, but not so much. And I think that's because most of the time, it hasn't seemed to me to be as relevant to the kind of adventures I've been running. So Shadowdark, for example, in Curse of Strahd, the players haven't gone, they have a couple times gone into places that are pitch black, but mostly they're pretty wary about that sort of thing in Curse of Strahd. They know about vampires, and so they've been trying to do as much in the daylight as they can. So having a real-time timer doesn't seem to be as interesting. And because Shadowdark, which I've been running Curse of Strahd, doesn't have a lot of huge dungeons or dungeon crawls, the idea that you're going to spend an hour or 2 or 3 in a dungeon just hasn't come up yet, really. So the idea that you're going to have 2 torches and they are going to only last for an hour each, and so that hasn't mattered. But if I were to play Shadowdark for a dungeon crawl, and I have in my actually, strangely enough, the other dungeon crawl that I've been doing, which is Castles in Tillin, doesn't really have a lot of dark places either. It's also very open and light, full of light, lots of windows and things like that. So I haven't really played a game where darkness has been a huge factor. I'm sure that will come up in Curse of Strahd. Resting is one of those things that I think is also really good in Shadowdark. The removal of short rests and just focusing on long rests makes this really great. Now, one downside, I might say, is not downside, but one thing that makes sense given the system, but also might make some old school gamers a little bit more wary of it, is that after a long rest, you get all your hit points back, and all stat damage is undone, and all of your abilities recharge. Which means that a long rest just completely refreshes your character back to the start. And some tables don't necessarily like that so much. So at my table, the only change I've been doing here is that stats recover at 1 point for a long rest. That's the difference. So that if your constitution goes down, which I've been doing differently, so it has been going down more, long rests only heal 1 point per day, regardless of the kind of stat damage you take. But if you wanted to play it as written, it would just be, there's no short rest, so you still have to get that long rest. And if you rest somewhere that is prone to interruption, you need to, that con save is what matters. If you fail that con save, you get no benefit from resting. You have to consume the ration, but you get no benefit from resting. So real danger there if you're trying to camp in a dungeon. Great rules there for pretty much the basic stuff that you'd imagine. How combat works and all that. Overland travel, decent rules for navigating, for food and water, turns and time, and then travel per day. These are all things that you can do in 5e easily enough. This just gives you here's how you do them in this game. There's no hugely complex system here for that. Downtime, carousing, and learning. Great new rules here. I like carousing in games, and I've often included it, even in non-Shadowdark games. Here it's been a lot of fun to do. Wizards and Thieves, an interesting little side game here. I'm glad that it includes it. Fun example of play. Now here is a part of the game that I really wanted to focus in on, which is the Game Master and the Game Master advice. The way that this game approaches helping you run the game. So much better, so superior to games like 5th edition in terms of what they present to you and how much they present to you and the clarity of what they give you. Basic ideas that you can read on a page or two, and you don't have to read 200 pages to understand. How to hook your players and basic ways of doing it. The audience, right? The players are the real audience, not the characters. Lean into this. Dramatic questions. And then the core ethos of this particular game. Time, darkness, gear, action economy, information, distance, danger, rewarding investment, and stat checks. That is the core ethos of Shadowdark. So you read this page, you know what Shadowdark is like. Time and darkness are the first 2 things. Time, darkness, and gear are the first 3 things. That's really good. You know the kind of game you're getting into by reading this page. And I almost wish this was on the first page. I think I would prefer that, actually, if this were just like on the title page. Putting it at page 104 means that, you're just... You have to have read 100 pages to get the core ethos of the game. By this point, hopefully you've intuited it, but it would be nice to have it right away. Balance and the unpredictability of the game. So good advice, page by page, on engaging your players here. In particular, engaging them into this style of game. with some more general advice as well. Now, you know, guys know my opinion on general advice. Very often it's not my favorite, but it's limited here, and this is intended to be a comprehensive book. So the way that it's presented here is great, one per page. The modes of play with some additional optional rules. I like this, super cool. Gives you permission to modify and hack the game. Do you want to play Hunter mode? Do you want to play Pulp mode? Do you want to play Grinder mode, Fatality mode, Chaos mode? Right, this idea that, look, there are lots of ways to make this game different. Here are some. That's cool. Random encounters go along with the mindset of the sort of game it is, right? We're talking more about here the exploration element and those the sort of more quick encounters because of the flattened math, because of the flattened numbers. Combat is faster, so random encounters that mostly often result in combat being more frequent is fine. 5th edition can't really afford that, so it tends to avoid, a lot of players of DMs avoid random encounters because you can't afford to bog down your session into, you know, totally random encounters that way. So if you're going to do random encounters, you have to plan them ahead of time, in which case they're not really random encounters after all. But having reactions and treasure chances and all that fits with the old school mindset, and that old school mindset happens in large portion because of the re-emphasis of exploration. Traps, same thing. Hazards, same thing. The Gauntlet as a level 0 idea is great, and I think this particular form of the level 0 game is great. Here's more XP and how to do it, like I've mentioned before. This is one area where I think, based on the adventures I've seen people publish online, experience is just needed. People in creating Shadowdark adventures they have not yet figured out how to, not everybody, some people have, but they have not yet figured out how to use this idea of poor, normal, fabulous, or legendary treasures in their adventures. And in using it to, you know, prioritize or to focus player action, right? So you might have normal treasure is stuff that you find on particular kinds of encounters. Poor treasure is what you find really on just like random encounters or like random treasure tables. Fabulous treasure might be like things that are hidden in particular portions of the dungeon, right? Maybe a legendary treasure is something that a campaign is built around. But fabulous, or maybe even just like an adventure. But fabulous treasure might be a way of drawing people into particular portions of your dungeon, right? So behind this locked grate, you know that down those passages is where the side tomb, where the crown of X, Y, and Z is buried. And so it's incredibly prized, it's well guarded. It's a fabulous treasure. That would be one way of drawing your party to different parts of the dungeon, but that involves giving people rumors and notes and information about that. So I think that there are really cool ways of using these categories in the game and in building your games around the categories of XP that players haven't really figured out yet. Or I would say designers haven't yet really figured out yet. There are obviously some who have, and Kelsey herself in her dungeons are like this, where there's an obvious treasure here, but it's hard to, or there's a risk in getting it. So risk, reward, choice. Whereas I think a lot of people are like, and you randomly find buried in this chest that has no indication a magic sword, and it's like, what? That's not necessarily the way to do this sort of XP system. You can do it. It's just it has less. There's potential here to use this in a really cool way, and that seems to be missing that potential. Okay, the tables in this book are excellent. Something happens tables, the rumor tables, the adventure tables, NPC tables, rival crawler tables, NPC names, map generation, easy map generation, overland hex map generation, settlement map generation, tavern generation, shop generation. The random tables in this book and the random encounter tables in this book are awesome. And it's an approach to DMing and to helping DMs that is really, really cool. The idea here isn't I'm going to give you a bunch of set things. Instead, I am going to, well, I guess these are set in one sense, but rather I am going to give you an immense amount of stuff that you can mix and match as you see fit. Instead of giving you a finished 10-piece puzzle of a really beautiful piece of art, right? You're given a 1,000-piece puzzle where the shapes all kind of fit together as you want, and it's up to you to put it together. Now, that is what some people love. It's what I prefer as a DM. And I think it's helpful because it gives you the DM, permission to develop your own adventures. You combine these things, and the result will be something really, really weird and random, and you're going to have to do some work to mold it into a good adventure. That should be the result of any good system book. Any good system book should help you, by the end of it, do your own thing. Now, not every book wants to do that. Right? Some books want to make you dependent upon the books themselves, right? So I would argue that 5th edition is like that. That the material is not, it's presented as a way of, here's how to run adventures. Here are some optional rules you can do to modify things. Here are a few random tables here and there, and some of them are really good, I will admit. Some of them are really good random tables. But for the most part, what you get is very, very general advice that leaves you hanging. And then you can buy the published books from 5th edition. And then you don't need to be that creative. You have the book that tells you how to generally run things, and then you have the particulars you're supposed to run. Now, do I think this is an intentional design? I don't know, it could be. But the fact that the DM's book is not that helpful in getting you on your own, creating your own adventures, it leads you to then have to buy other people's published stuff, rather than be creative on your own. What this book does is it gives you so much material that this book is all you need, and then you can then go on and develop your own stuff. Yes, you can buy secondary supplemental material. Yes, you can buy other official adventures from the Arcane Library, but you don't have to. And this book gives you everything you need to do it on your own. It makes you, or it helps to prepare you to actually be creative at the table and in your prep and in your adventure design and generation. That's what these sorts of random tables do. That's what the advice in this book does. It's why I like it. One of the reasons why I like it. Monster Generator is really cool. Monster Mutations, really great tables. Small, very limited, but helpful. And then I like the level advice here. Level 0 to 3 are weaker common creatures. Level 4 to 6 are risky creatures. They correspond to the kinds of treasure, therefore the kinds of XP you're going to get from them. I like this 1-to-1 monsters average party level and the 1-to-1 monster level that you're going to want. If the average party level is 4 to 6, then the monster level should be around 3 each. And then you have monster statistics, which are simple, straightforward, and all have something cool about them. Or almost all of them have something cool about them. It's not just, the ape is just the ape, right? But he has a climb speed. That's cool. That's something different about that. But, even the most basic stat block, which is the peasant, I believe, it's a baseline. The art in here is very flavorful. The descriptions are short and to the point. Now, the one thing that I really liked about the in-depth 5e Monster Manual, which I think is one of the best books that 5e released, the base Monster Manual, and then Volo's. I really liked Volo's Guide to Monsters. But one of the things I liked about it was that occasionally it would give you adventure hooks built into the creatures. I think that's really cool. And I think sometimes maybe a little bit more space on that would be worth it. Not for necessarily every creature, but maybe for some of them. Give a hook or two, a flavor lore hook, not necessarily like farmers have been having their cattle stolen or something like that. But give them something, for some of them, that, help spark the GM's interest. Right, so a gelatinous cube is a translucent cube of slime that silently mows through tunnels. Fair enough, that's fine. But if you give instead there something that indicates how it might be formed, or a point as to, sometimes they have a flicker of intelligence or something. You could do something like that, which makes it, that's an interesting kind of hook. And I guess some of them do. For example, cloud giants, they do not allow outsiders into their enclaves. Okay, that's cool. Something like that for other creatures would have been cool. But very often it's just a description. Okay, fair enough. It's a nitpick, if anything. It's not even really a nitpick, because sometimes it is presented. But I do think that more often than not in 5th edition in the Monster Manual, yeah, they gave way too much information in some that was totally useless, and a lot of those pages didn't have anything, but some of them had a lot of really cool lore that was gameable, and I think that would have been cool. But the game here is trying to be minimalistic. It's trying to present just the bare minimum that is necessary. So I can't fault it too much in that regard. And there are some bosses that are given where that is presented. So Oba Ix, for example. Wrath of Gammon is another good example there. Lots and lots and lots and lots of creatures. The Tarask with 140 hit points, which in Shadowdark is a lot of hit points. I love its quote at the bottom. Great image there. The Wandering Merchant, which is an interesting little creature. Okay, getting through creatures here, you get treasure. And this is one of, I think, the best sections of this book and why it's worthwhile buying even if you have no intention of ever playing this game. And that is the treasure tables. Weak treasure, mid-tier treasure, normal treasure, I should say. Epic treasure, and then legendary treasure. That's awesome. And then tables for unique features on mundane items, what they're made of, and the item itself. Boons that you can attach to these items, or just oaths that you can get, including things like the secrets and blessings. I think that's really cool. And then magic item attributes. You can generate your own magic items with a certain number of benefits and curses if it has a personality, virtues, and flaws. Idea generators, magic item idea generators, and then different types of armor with armor features, armor benefits, and armor curses. Potions and the effects of mixing potions, potion benefits and curses. Scrolls and wands and the things that can be attached to those. Utility items with their type and feature, benefit and curse. Weapons with their feature, benefit, and curse. Item virtues, item flaws, personality traits, and then designing your own magic items and advice for that. With warnings about things like dark vision, light, or gear slots. Really cool. I like that. And then particular magic items, examples of it, and these are all really awesome. I think some of them are pretty standard, like bags of holding. Some of them are much more interesting. Now, one of the things with the bag of holding, the benefit is that it can hold up to 10 gear slots. That's it. 10. So is that awesome? Yes. But it does not break this idea that, okay, even with a bag of holding, you get 10 extra slots. That's an extra character, basically. Not all that much. Because that portion of the game, carrying capacity, is so important, even a magic item which is designed to minimize it is still not that strong, because if you were to make it as bottomless as you have in 5e pretty much, then essentially you would be taking out one of the parts of this game. And this, Kelsey is very careful to never trivialize one of the key elements of her own game, which 5e doesn't seem to notice. 5e does that all the time. They trivialize seemingly important elements of their own game by abilities or magic items or things like that. So again, lots and lots of cool magic items. Some of them are things we're familiar with. Some of them are unique to this. And I like here, for example, True Name. This is a magic item, quote unquote, but it's just the idea of finding someone's true name. You have advantage on attack rolls and spellcasting checks, targeting your creature whose true name you utter. Great advice. I shouldn't say great advice. A great little boon. That's really cool. Makes it you're much more likely to be able to take a creature. With a character sheet at the end, and then, credits and things like that at the back of the book, with some random tables for names. Because once again, you could print these out and put them into your screen. Okay, so this book, Shadowdark, is incredible. Really, really awesome. What do I like most about it? Flat math. It accomplishes what 5e was trying to do, which, I think is interesting in and of itself. It accomplishes what 5e was trying to do, or rather what 5e said it was trying to do. I don't know if it actually was intending to do that, but it does that. It does away with a lot of the extraneous stuff and gets to the real core of 5th edition, which is flat math. Flat math based on that curve, on the very basic curve of your ability scores. And those aren't going to change all that much as you go up. And then there's been a bunch of tweaks that are things you could do to 5th edition, but that are core to this game, that reduce the further problems of things like min-maxing or AC creep or HP creep, right? So limiting modifier use on certain things like health and attack and damage. reducing armor class on plate armor, reducing the damage of ranged weapons, and reducing the number of finesse weapons. Giving to each class a particular unique role and randomizing their progression so that you can't choose, your particular feat to break the game in this way or that way. By reducing the number of character sheet solutions and by adding on risks to those solutions, you force the players to aim at player solutions. And by increasing the randomness and the power of the dice, right? Because when your modifiers are all lower, you're much more dependent upon what you actually roll, right? If the DC is 15, but I have a plus 10, then the dice roll is mostly insignificant. Yeah, there's a small chance I can fail, but mostly the die roll is just there to confirm what I am already good at. That's not the case in Shadowdark. The die roll is much more important. So by emphasizing that, the players are going to discover over time that they need to minimize the amount of times they need to roll. Because yeah, you could succeed 50-50 maybe, or maybe a little bit more of that, maybe less. But if you fail, it's real bad. So minimize the amount of times you have to roll. Okay, that means we have to be clever in our preparation and our approach. So by doing all of these things, Shadowdark has simplified itself from 5e. And that's really, I think, what Shadowdark is trying to do. Shadowdark is designed for, in a word, 5e players. Really? I mean, that's really what it's doing. If you're happy with old school essentials, and you see Shadowdark, you're going to say, why do I need this? My table has been perfectly happy with a game that is very procedural. It has a good combination of old school exploration and combat and magic items and all of that. So, for tables that are as firmly established in the OSR, Shadowdark is an interesting flavor. It's an interesting new kind of game to try, but it is not necessarily going to appeal to them, right? But for a generation of gamers now, a generation of role players that has come into the game at 5th edition and is now getting tired of 5th edition for any number of reasons, to jump into old school essentials, that's a big ask, right? Whereas something like Shadowdark is a really good, I wouldn't even say first step, it's a good home for people who enjoy the basic system of D&D 5e, who enjoy the simplicity of the 6 attribute scores of ascending armor class, of a d20 rollover system. Not roll under, rollover system. People who like the basic ideas of 5th edition, but who are unaware yet, or maybe who are about to discover that they really do want a challenge. They really do want to focus on the dungeon crawl aspect of the game. They want to emphasize or re-emphasize exploration. For those people, Shadowdark is awesome. Really, really good. And that's why I think it fits my table and my players so well, because we have been playing 5th edition for a long time and we're getting tired of very long combats. We're getting tired of exploration not really mattering. We're having a lot of fun, and occasionally from time to time when I've tried a dungeon crawl in 5e, people have had a ton of fun with it, until they realize, oh yeah, this is kind of because we haven't picked this one spell, isn't it? If we pick that, we could just ignore this one aspect of this. And then they do, because someone's like, well, I'm not going to leave it on the table, right? I'm going to use that. And then suddenly, okay, never mind, it's not that much fun anymore. So for my table, this has been a great system. And I've modified a couple things, but mostly I've been playing this game as written. And I think in that regard, it's exactly what I want. So, style, 10 out of 10, A+ for style. The game presents itself very clearly and neatly. There aren't errors. I didn't notice any mistakes in terms of grammar or in terms of composition. So it's been edited incredibly well. The hyperlinks mean it's that you can access any of these things very easily as long as you keep the table of contents open. The sort of information that's presented is presented clearly on either 1 or 2 page spreads throughout the entire book, so that you're never having to flip through many, many sections to find the thing that you want. And you don't have to read a lot to get the core point of every single system and piece of advice in the game. It's right there in a paragraph or 2. So, absolute props given in terms of its layout and its design. Everything is easy to read, appeals to the eye. The art is excellent. Especially, it fits the style of art that I love. Content, 10 out of 10, A+. The content of this game it does precisely what it sets out to do. It presents a fun, simplified, flat math version of 5e with an emphasis on exploration and a re-emphasis on player solution and player creativity by removing a lot of those things that 5e added in for whatever reason, getting in the way of that pillar of D&D. Without, I would say, undermining a lot of the other aspects of it. Now, all of this praise, is there anything it doesn't do well? Well, I think there are some players who aren't going to like it. Progression is limited, and you don't get a lot of say over your progression. If you're a caster, you can pick the spells that you learn. That's about it. Otherwise, you're dependent upon the rolls that you get for your talents and hit points, and the magic items you find that the DM presents to you in the dungeons. So progression is very limited, and some players are going to love that. They don't care about progression. Some players who want to focus on builds, they're going to be happier with Pathfinder 2nd Edition, or with 5e, to some extent. Those games where, or let's be honest, they'd be happy with something like Crown and Skull, where progression and build is kind of one in one. You're building your character from scratch. It's a classless system. That's a game that those sorts of players would like, I think, more than this. So if progression is important to your table, to your players, maybe Shadowdark isn't for you. Now, there are some supplements that you can get out there that lean into 5e's character choice at leveling up. There are feat tables and ways of adding them into the game. But just keep in mind that every time you add in one of those systems, what you're doing is going away from what 5e claimed it was doing and what Shadowdark is trying to do, which is flatten that curve and present a consistent experience from level 1 to level 10. That ascending power curve will do exactly, if you add those systems back into Shadowdark, you'll do exactly what happens when you add those systems into 5th edition, which is at higher levels the game will become unstable. So keep that in mind. This is an eminently hackable system, just like 5e is. But if you're hacking it up, if you're adding in things, you run the risk of turning this into a slightly different version of 5th edition. So keep that in mind if you're going to hack this game. It is eminently hackable, but you've got to know what you're doing. One of my players, for example, was trying to, and this is just an example, I know this is a very long video, but I do want to include this. One of my players was trying to add in more finesse weapons because he wanted to play a dex fighter. And so he was like, well, can I have a rapier that does a d8? Can I do this, that, or the other thing? Can I do all these things? And I was like, look, the design behind the game, I just explained it. I said, look, the game was designed so that fighters and strength-based combatants did the most damage. So I'm happy to work with you as much as I can, but I don't want to take away the value of that class from anyone else who wants to play it. So I'm not going to let you build a dex-based fighter or a dex ranger or whatever that does as much damage as any other class. That's not what this game is going to do. And he was like, all right, fair enough. So, you got to keep that in mind. Okay, well, as I said, 10 out of 10, highly recommend Shadowdark, especially when you get the book in print. I think this is going to be an excellent, I'm always going to be carrying this around. Even if I don't run the game, I'm going to be using the tables from it. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this deeper dive into a particular book, and I will see you all in another video.